In a world in which everybody calls these pine and eucalyptus plantations planted forests, it's interesting to see that in Chile they've been given another, much more appropriate name. In Chile, people call them planted soldiers. Planted soldiers because they're all lined up in rows, they are green, and they're advancing relentlessly on people. A forest is not simply a collection of trees. A forest is an entire ecosystem which includes an integrally functioning water cycle, a cycle of soil nutrients, and all the flora and fauna which accompany the trees, as well as bushes, shrubs, lianas, epiphyte and parasitic plants growing on the trees, and so on. That's what a forest is. If you look at the ground in a pine plantation, you see an accumulation of pine needles, of dead material, in which there's almost no life at all. You don't see any birds, you don't see any insects. It's a desert for local fauna from the food point of view. When you're in one of these great monoculture plantations of introduced trees, what you see, what you hear, is almost total silence. The only sound is the breaking of branches which haven't decomposed. And they haven't decomposed precisely because there's none of the flora and fauna, micro and macro flora and fauna, whose job it is to decompose the organic matter which falls from the trees and to reincorporate this into the soil. In other words, there are a series of repeated impacts which occur precisely because these are not forests. So when we talk about this plantation problem, the main point is not that we are against tree plantations per se. We are against a certain type of tree plantation. But at the same time, it's important to define them as tree plantations or as tree crops and not as planted forests. The first problem is usually that these plantations are on a huge scale and they occupy lands or forests which were already being used by local populations. So the survival and the livelihoods of all these local populations are affected. They lose their lands.
Most of the villagers have sold their land and gone away. When the company came and started planting eucalyptus near the rice fields, the water began to dry up and people found they couldn't grow rice. One by one they began to sell their land and leave. They went to work as hired labor in other areas or with a company. They have to earn a living somehow.
I've got 10 children. My husband died when the smallest child was 10. I'm like this because I suffered nervous problems from the shock of my husband's death. We're very poor and I have to raise my children alone. I had some farmland which I used as a guarantee so my son-in-law could borrow money. But then he couldn't repay the loan, so I had to. The company tried to take my land because I was in debt. Mrs. Chum Chai was sued by the company and had to take witnesses to court to prove that the land really belonged to her. She was threatened and harassed by the company and the police. Eventually, with the help of lawyers, the court ruled in her favor.
Yeah, ready?
Local people have lost a lot of land to the company's eucalyptus plantations. The company planted in protected forest areas, on village common land, in rice fields and village gardens. The government says that the eucalyptus is like a forest, but it's not. It's just like another cash crop. They have to harvest it and sell it after 5 and 6 years. After cutting the trees, the soil is left bare and the dead leaves affect the soil's fertility.
We're standing here in the community of Huillinco, which goes as far as the lake. All this area used to belong to the Mapuche, but it was divided up and sold off to private owners, but sold dirt cheap. People sold a hectare for a lamb or a calf, or 5 or 6 hectares for a pair of oxen. We think the government owes a great debt towards the Mapuche people, because if we have no land, we're finished. We aren't professionals, we don't work in offices, we can only live off the land.
First of all, it has to be recognized that there is a conflict with the Mapuche people. And as far as we are concerned, this conflict has, if you like, 3 central themes. And the first one is really what Don Juan was talking about, the historic debt owing to the Mapuche people after the expropriation, the theft and the usurpation of the Mapuche lands and territory. And the second aspect is the rights of the Mapuche people to get this lost territory, this homeland, back. And to add to this is the fact that the vast majority of these lands are now in the hands of the forestry firms and are suffering severe environmental problems. These plantations you can see behind us have serious consequences for the lake. Helicopters and planes are being used to fumigate the plantations. Toxic chemicals are being poured on them, and when it rains, these flow down the stream beds and into the lake. Then there's the erosion. It's clearly getting progressively worse. They use clear cutting here, which is the most damaging logging technique there is, because it leaves nothing at all behind. And because the plantations go down to the lake edge, everything ends up in the water.
The interesting thing is that everywhere these plantations are established, whether in Chile, in Brazil, in Indonesia, Thailand, South Africa or Malaysia, as soon as they reach a certain size, people start to protest against them. In Thailand, for instance, people hate the eucalyptus trees. I've never seen such hatred anywhere in the world. And there's a very simple reason for this, in fact. These people are peasants, and the main item in their diet is rice. Rice means life. And when eucalyptus plantations are established here, not only do people lose part of their land, they also lose their water supply. When the water table dries up, you can't grow rice anymore. They call the eucalyptus the selfish tree.
The water levels are affected because of the eucalyptus. Small streams are disappearing and the soil gets dry and hard. You can see for yourself. Even after it rains, the soil dries up very quickly. Before, it used to retain the water for 10 to 20 days. Not anymore.
The first thing I had to do to find out about what it used to be like was to ask my grandfather, my uncles. I asked them, what was this land like before? And what I heard from them was that 20, 40 or 50 years ago, this was all native forest. But today there's hardly any left of it. There's a place I know that I used to visit about 20 years ago. Such a beautiful mountain it was, such lovely water and streams there. Then one day I went back there, 20 years later, and I couldn't find anything. There's nothing left, no forest, no water, nothing. And that really made me feel bad. So that's why with my neighbours nowadays, I'm doing everything I possibly can to recover what's left of the native woods. And we're teaching the youngsters all about protecting the native forests. In some of my neighbours' land, their fathers and grandfathers planted eucalyptus, and today they've got no water left. The wells have dried up. So every time I go to their places to find water for them, I always find eucalyptus trees close to the dry wells. Once these wells had water only a metre beneath the ground, and now you have to dig down 7 metres to find water. So I say to them, in the future, what do they reckon is the best thing to leave to their children? Are they going to leave them eucalyptus or water wells?
So what happens after the plantations have gone? That's the question. If we look at the history of this type of monocultures introduced on a worldwide scale, they've led to the total destruction of people's livelihoods and of the ecosystems in which the people used to live. So what they have always meant is, first of all, the appropriation of the land which belonged to the local people. Secondly, the creation of an economic boom which has benefited very few local people, just a few. Then, once these crops have come to an end, the big corporations simply move out, leaving a complete disaster behind them, and people are a lot worse off than they were before they came. There are also some other impacts which are described as environmental. For example, the loss of biodiversity. Since these are monocultures on a huge scale, the local flora and fauna tend to disappear. And what does this loss of biodiversity mean to local people? This biodiversity is part of their daily diet, for a start. People who live in tropical rainforests live largely off the forest. They find their food there, their medicines, their firewood and wood to keep them warm. The forest is a huge larder, a pharmacy, and it provides them with almost all their basic needs.
Well, first of all, what we Mapuche want to do is to get back to our old ways, our traditions, the authentic, the Mapuche way of doing things. As Mapuche, well, we're happy to be Mapuche. At least I'm happy to be a Mapuche. For so many years we've been ignored and abandoned by all the governments who've never given us any help, and so now we need to show what we're worth. Show that we're human beings too, and that we need to develop, and that we need to work, but honest work.
Como persona y trabajar, pero trabajar en forma honesta. Y los recursos los tenemos.
We've got all the natural resources, even if we haven't got any money. We've got the lake, so beautiful it is, and the lovely landscapes, the trees. And what little bit of land we have, we're going to give it special treatment, getting it back the way it was, authentic, organic.
Un tratamiento especial, recuperando lo auténtico como es lo orgánico. La tierra, darle su alimento.
Feeding it properly, giving it what it deserves, nothing artificial.
Ponerle lo propio, lo que era
In the old days, we Mapuche never used chemical fertilizers to produce good, clean, healthy food.
Comida sana y limpia.
We need to plant native trees. For example, natural trees, not pines, which the Winca, the white men, have been imposing on us. Trees like the araucaria, the meñillo, the avellano, the boldo, native trees like the raili. We use them for so many things, for dyeing our wools, for food to keep us alive, to work with. It's a hard life, but I love it. I wouldn't go back to live in the town, even if I had the money. I wouldn't go back because I'd feel as if I was in a cage. Everything's free here, free and peaceful and healthy.
Tranquilo y sano.
Bueno, el árbol es un canelo. Ya esto sale donde.
Well, this tree is a canelo. It only grows beside water. It's medicinal. It's good for bruises, for wounds, and for headaches. You put a leaf on your forehead, and your headache goes. You don't need to take an aspirin or anything.
Of course, I'm not against people planting trees. What we're talking about here is a certain type of tree plantation, a type of forestry model which is what is causing all these problems. These are the large-scale plantations of introduced species carried out according to the precepts of the Green Revolution. And this model is sold to people in two different ways. It's sold from the environmental point of view, and it's sold from the social or socio-economic point of view. From the environmental viewpoint, because of what I said at the beginning, we are told that they are planting forests, and people's perception of forest is that it is something positive. So the first mechanism is to appeal to people's environmental conscience and to trick people by telling them something which in fact isn't true. The second mechanism is also false. We are told that plantations will bring employment and development to a region or to a country. On the one hand, the forestry firms tells us we are hiring 7,000 local people. So you think, well, this firm is creating 7,000 new jobs. This is a simplistic argument. What you have to realize is that the forestry firm has taken over land which wasn't empty before it arrived. In most cases, there were peasant farmers living here and they were producing food.
In Espírito Santo, in Bahia, Brazil, the giant Aracruz company has more than 200,000 hectares of plantations and is the world's largest producer of bleached eucalyptus pulp. Father José Koopmans interviewed a local peasant farmer who didn't want to sell his land to the company.
Opa! Oh, companheiro!
Hello, everything all right?
Working hard?
Yes, very hard.
What are you planting right now?
Sweet potatoes, beans, manioc.
Ah, manioc.
Mandioca mansa? Escuta aqui, se eu te ofereço...
If I were to offer you a good price for your land, would you sell it to me?
Você vende para mim?
No, I wouldn't sell it to you. I can't work anywhere else because I've never learnt to do anything else. What would happen if I sold you my land? I'd take the money, go to the city, and in 6 months all the money I got from you has been eaten up. But I go on living. I'm too old to work for the company. They won't take me on. You see, I couldn't sell you my land.
A firma não me quer mais. Já tô velho. Isso eu não quero mais você não aguenta. E daí? O que é que eu vou fazer?
So why did so many other people here sell their land?
Venderem a sua terra.
Because they didn't think. Because they're even weaker in the head than me.
A lot of the people who sold their land regret it now.
Como é que é?
So many promises were made to them.
One man has even died. He didn't have anything left to eat, the poor old man. He couldn't work anymore, and he didn't have a field anymore. That's the way it goes. If you take the money and leave your land, it's all over.
Então não é bom. Não é bom.
So it's not a good idea to sell your land?
No.
But I don't understand why.
Eu não entendo porque aqueles hoje em dia
Half the population of San Jose used to own their own land.
eu acho que a metade do povo que está morando lá hoje, antigamente tinha
All of them, or nearly all of them. Where the eucalyptus stands today is where people used to live. To the right, over there.
Mais ou menos, se não dá conta andar hoje,
The people who sold their land, are they doing better or worse than you?
É melhor do que a tua situação ou é pior?
É pior.
Worse. I know someone who used to have some land. He grew bananas, coffee. He had grapefruit trees, everything he needed to eat. Today he's sweeping the streets in town and earns $100, which he has to wait 3 months for.
So you were wiser than him not to sell your land?
Yes, I was. I'm staying here. When I'm hungry and my money runs out, I just go outside and pick a coconut or an orange. I've got something to munch on. Everything I need is here, while he's sweeping the streets and earns 100 reais.
In South Africa, pine, eucalyptus and acacia plantations now cover an area of at least 1.5 million hectares. And this has had a big impact on the natural grassland ecosystems known as the veld, which is where the greatest biodiversity is to be found. Paradoxically, despite all these plantations, the South African population is terribly short of firewood, which is used for cooking and heating.
So what type of jobs do they create? They create plenty of jobs at the beginning, when the plantations are being established. But these jobs are seasonal for a set amount in very poor working conditions with bad food, bad accommodation and so on. The kind of jobs which are not desirable if you're trying to improve the living standards of a rural population. But what's worse is that these jobs come to an end once the plantations have been established. And during the time which elapses between planting and the harvest, there are almost no jobs. Just minimal surveillance work and, what's more, directed against the local population. And when it's time to harvest the trees, which used to provide a good deal of work for the teams of men with their chainsaws, today's modern tree harvesting machinery means that practically no jobs are created, because one machine does the work which used to be done by several teams of loggers. So at the local level, practically no employment is generated. Some jobs may be created in other areas, for example in the transport of the timber, which may provide some jobs. If the timber harvest is to go for producing wood pulp, this hardly generates any jobs. The giant modern pulp mills, which cost anything up to $1 billion each to build, probably only create between 200 and 300 new jobs each, and jobs which don't go to local people, because they go for highly qualified workers who are brought in from somewhere else. So at the local level, the only jobs created by these pulp mills is low-paid, unqualified work as cleaners or guards.
In South Africa, as elsewhere, the huge pulp mills are creating serious water and air contamination problems.
The reason for the introduction of these plantations, which are increasing all over the world, especially in tropical countries, is really quite simple. The trouble is that Europe has hardly any forests left to produce enough timber and paper for its own consumption. And the same goes for the US and for Japan. So the biggest consumers, on the one hand, see their own forests have all disappeared or are in the process of disappearing. And at the same time, these countries have strong environmental movements which are fighting to save what's left of their primary forests. So the huge international paper industry has set its sights on the south and is encouraging plantations or directly planting in these countries of the so-called Third World. First of all, because land is cheap here, compared to the price of land in the US or particularly in Europe or Japan. Labor is also cheap. This is also important. And the environmental regulations either don't exist or are very elastic, to put it euphemistically. And what's more, trees grow very quickly in these countries. A tree which takes maybe 80 years to grow in Finland takes only 5 in Brazil or 6 in Uruguay. Furthermore, the governments in these countries are all promoting, either directly or indirectly, this type of monoculture. And why are they doing this? Because they are under pressure from organizations such as the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank to make their overseas debt repayments, and because of the need to encourage export-oriented economies. But in order to do so, the raw materials must be cheap. And to ensure that they are low cost, governments in southern countries, almost all of them, are first of all subsidizing this type of tree plantation. The citizens in all of these countries are, in fact, subsidizing the huge forestry firms and, in the final analysis, are subsidizing the consumer in the first world. In Chile, for example, if a forestry firm establishes a plantation, at the end of the first year it is refunded 75% of the cost of the planting process. In Uruguay the refund is 50% of the cost. It's also 50% in Paraguay as well as in Argentina. What's more, the forestry firms pay absolutely no taxes. Every other kind of activity has to. Farmers, cattle ranchers, industry as well. Everybody else pays taxes. And in the forestry sector, it's even worse than that, for 2 reasons. Firstly, because these firms are huge and economically very powerful, and they really don't need this kind of subsidy. But secondly, because at the local level, not only do local governments stop receiving the considerable amount of money from taxes they used to, but at the same time, they have to spend much more to repair all the roads that the forestry firms destroy with their huge logging trucks. The subject of consumption is really both the cause and result of a particular scheme of production. Paper is not mainly used for books, as is usually claimed. Ah yes, we need more paper because more and more people can read and write. The point is that this is not what the bulk of paper production goes for. This totally unnecessary consumption of paper is bringing about the destruction of people's lives in other parts of the world, as well as the destruction of the environment.
Across the world, resistance to plantations is growing. The Mapuche in Chile, the Tupinambquin in Brazil, and different ethnic groups in Thailand are just some of the peoples struggling to recover their lands from the forestry companies. These primary forests are too precious to be exchanged for a harvest of paper pulp.